Hello, viewers. Welcome to Deep Sight. Let us pick up where we left off in our previous issue and continue exploring the history of Europe. 4. The Austrian Empire. Survival in a whirlpool of nations. Metternich's departure, the end of an era. If any single individual's downfall in 1848 held the greatest symbolic significance, it was undoubtedly that of Klemens von Metternich. Having served as Austrian Chancellor in Vienna for nearly 4 decades, he stood as the foremost architect and guardian of Europe's conservative order. The Congress of Vienna, which he presided over, successfully suppressed the forces of liberalism and nationalism unleashed during the Napoleonic era. Furthermore, the Metternich system he constructed enabled reactionary forces to maintain political dominance across Europe for decades. In the eyes of many liberals, Metternich was the very embodiment of oppression and despotism. On March 13, 1848, massive demonstrations erupted in Vienna. Angry crowds poured into the streets, chanting slogans demanding reform and clashing violently with the military and police. That very evening, besieged by crises both domestic and foreign, Metternich made a clandestine exit. He quietly fled Vienna in a laundress's covered wagon, eventually making his way into exile in England. The old man who had once dominated the European political stage thus exited the theater of history in a rather ignominious fashion. As news of his departure spread, the entire city of Vienna erupted in jubilation, and liberals across Europe hastened to share the tidings. It seemed that an era had truly come to an end. Under mounting pressure, the Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand I promptly announced a series of concessions. He pledged to enact a constitution, convene a constituent assembly, and abolish the system of serfdom that had persisted for centuries. The abolition of serfdom proved to be the most enduring social reform undertaken in Austria throughout the entire revolutionary period. Millions of peasants, previously bound to the land, thereby gained their personal freedom, a transformative change whose profound impact far outweighed any subsequent political gains or losses. The fragmentation of the empire. Every nation seeks its own springtime. However, the challenges confronting the Austrian Empire were far more complex than those faced by other nations. It was, in the truest sense, a multi-ethnic empire. Within its vast territory lived Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Slovenes, Italians, Poles, Romanians, and others, each nation possessing its own distinct language, culture, and political aspirations. The revolutions of 1848 thus also marked a massive eruption of these various national consciousnesses. In Hungary, the revolutionary movement was led by the charismatic Lajos Kossuth, an exceptionally eloquent lawyer and journalist. He ignited the political fervor of the Hungarian nation through his impassioned oratory. The Hungarian Diet passed the March Laws, establishing a form of personal union with Austria. Subsequently, they went a step further, declaring complete independence and founding the Hungarian Republic, with Kossuth serving as its governor-president. In Bohemia, the Czech historian and statesman František Palacký put forward a starkly different vision. He declined an invitation to join the Frankfurt Parliament, reasoning that he was, first and foremost, a Czech, not a German. He advocated for the realization of federal equality among the various nations within the empire, all while acknowledging the overarching framework of the Austrian Empire, proposing an Austrian solution rather than one based on national secession. This Austro-Slavist line of thought embodied a pragmatic yet subtle form of political wisdom. These competing national aspirations, in fact, constituted the most profound internal contradiction of the revolution. While the Hungarians strove for their own independence, they were unwilling to grant equal national rights to the Croats, Slovaks, and Romanians living within their own borders. The Croatian military commander Jelačić, himself a participant in a nationalist movement, ultimately led his forces against Hungary, becoming a crucial instrument for the Habsburg dynasty in suppressing the revolution. This episode starkly revealed the paradox of European nationalism in 1848. Nations striving for their own liberation often lacked empathy for the liberation aspirations of others. The Habsburg counterattack. How an empire regained its footing. In the autumn of 1848, the Habsburg dynasty launched a systematic counteroffensive. The young Franz Joseph I ascended the throne in December, replacing the frail Ferdinand I with a vigorous and energetic presence. A renewed uprising in Vienna was forcibly suppressed, and the Constituent Assembly was subsequently dissolved. A constitution unilaterally promulgated by the government replaced the version drafted by the revolutionaries, a document that was itself effectively discarded within a few years, as the empire reverted to the path of absolute monarchy. Hungarian resistance proved the most tenacious, with fighting continuing until the summer of 1849. Franz Joseph appealed to Tsar Nicholas I for assistance, and Russian troops subsequently poured across the border under the pretext of suppressing the revolution. Caught in a pincer movement between the combined Russian and Austrian forces, the Hungarian army was compelled to surrender. Kossuth went into exile abroad, and the Hungarian independence movement came to an end. Yet, history offered a profound irony. Austria's reliance on Russian aid deeply damaged the Habsburg dynasty's international reputation and diplomatic autonomy, sowing the seeds for the eventual rupture in Austro-Russian relations during the subsequent Crimean War. Italy, the harbinger and frustration of national revival. Background of the Risorgimento, a divided peninsula. Italy's situation bore striking resemblances to that of Germany, yet it possessed a unique historical character of its own. This land, the cradle of ancient Roman civilization, the Renaissance and Baroque art, was, in the mid-19th century, similarly fragmented, divided among numerous independent political entities. In the north, Lombardy and Venetia were under direct Austrian rule. The central region comprised the Papal States and various duchies such as Tuscany. The south was the Kingdom of Sicily, also known as the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, ruled by the Bourbon dynasty, while the northwest was home to the relatively enlightened Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont. Italian intellectuals and patriots dubbed their unification movement the Risorgimento, meaning rebirth or revival. This movement encompassed several competing political paths. Giuseppe Mazzini advocated for the establishment of a unified, Republican Italy. Moderates favored an Italian federation under the spiritual leadership of the Pope, while pragmatists, particularly politicians within the Kingdom of Sardinia, favored a monarchical path to unification, centered on the Piedmontese royal house. The 5 Days of Milan. Ordinary citizens confront Austrian elites. From March 18th to March 22nd, 1848, emboldened by the revolutions in France and Vienna, Milan erupted in an armed uprising later known as the 5 Days of Milan. It remains one of the most moving chapters of the entire revolutions of 1848. The Austrian garrison consisted of approximately 20,000 highly trained elite soldiers, commanded by the battle-hardened Field Marshal Radetzky. Standing against them were the ordinary citizens of Milan, armed with hunting rifles, spears, and even farm implements, who engaged this professional army in a 5-day battle amidst the city's narrow streets and buildings. Capitalizing on their intimate knowledge of the terrain, the citizens transformed the streets into a labyrinth, hurled stones from rooftops, and constructed barricades using dismantled furniture. After 5 days of fierce fighting, Radetzky was compelled to lead the Austrian forces in a withdrawal from Milan, a development that sent shockwaves across all of Europe. An uprising in Venice erupted almost simultaneously. Under the leadership of the lawyer Manin, it proclaimed the restoration of the Republic of Venice, an entity that Napoleon had dismantled in 1797. Seizing the moment, King Charles Albert of the Kingdom of Sardinia declared war, fanning the flames of a national conflict across the entirety of northern Italy. The Roman Republic, Mazzini's utopia, and Garibaldi's legend. In 1849, the revolutionary fire in central Italy burned brightest, albeit most briefly, in Rome. Following the flight of Pope Pius IX, a constituent assembly was convened to proclaim the establishment of the Roman Republic. It subsequently invited Mazzini, who had spent years in exile, to return and assume leadership of the new state. Mazzini was finally able to put his ideals into practice on the very soil for which he had dedicated his entire life to fighting. The Roman Republic declared the abolition of the Pope's temporal power, instituted religious tolerance, guaranteed freedom of the press, and introduced free education. It was a sincere experiment in democracy, however fleeting its existence. The heavy military burden of defending this republic fell upon the shoulders of Garibaldi, a legendary figure who had previously fought in numerous wars of independence across South America. Garibaldi utilized his extraordinary military acumen and personal charisma to lead a volunteer force, the Redshirts. Outnumbered, he engaged in a months-long struggle outside the walls of Rome against a combined coalition of French, Austrian, and Neapolitan forces. Following the defeat in battle, Garibaldi led his surviving troops in a daring breakout. Pursued relentlessly, they undertook a grueling, long-distance fighting retreat that would go down in Italian national history as one of its most epic and heroic marches. During this arduous withdrawal, his wife, Anita, fell ill and died, thereby becoming an enduring martyr figure within the Italian national movement. The Roman Republic ultimately collapsed in July 1849, and the Pope returned to Rome under the protection of French troops. Charles Albert, having suffered defeat in the war against Austria, abdicated in despair. His son, Victor Emmanuel II, succeeded him to the throne. Thus, the Italian revolutions of 1848 came to a close. Yet, Mazzini's ideals and Garibaldi's name had already been indelibly etched into the collective memory of the Italian nation. 6. Why did the revolution fail? A structural historical analysis. As the smoke of 1848 gradually cleared, almost all of Europe's major revolutionary movements had ended in failure. The monarchs of the Ancien regime, after their initial panic, they moved swiftly to consolidate their power. What precisely accounts for this outcome? The first reason lies in the fundamental fissures within the revolutionary coalitions themselves. Each revolution of 1848 was driven by a temporary, cobbled-together alliance of disparate groups with vastly different agendas. The liberal bourgeoisie sought constitutional reform but wished to preserve their property. Nationalists aspired to nation-states, yet vied with one another over territorial claims. Social reformers sought to ameliorate the plight of the working class, but their proposed solutions terrified the bourgeoisie, and peasants desired land and the abolition of feudal obligations, yet often remained indifferent to broader political issues. This fragile alliance could hold together only while confronting a common enemy. The moment the old order yielded even slightly, internal divisions surfaced and the coalition rapidly disintegrated. The second reason was the astonishing resilience demonstrated by the military forces of the Ancien regime. This is a stark reality often overlooked by romanticized historical narratives. Street barricades and revolutionary fervor ultimately proved no match for highly organized, well-trained, and superbly equipped standing armies. Whether it was Cavaignac in France or Radetzky and Windischgratz in Austria, these professional generals, once the initial shock had passed, reorganized their forces and executed their suppression campaigns with the cool precision of career soldiers. The success or failure of a revolution depends, to a large extent, on whether the army defects. Yet in the Europe of 1848, the military by and large remained loyal to its monarchs. The third reason was the almost total lack of coordination among revolutionary forces across different regions. Although the revolutions of 1848 appear on a map as a synchronized European phenomenon, the revolutionary movements in individual nations were, in reality, highly isolated, lacking any substantive communication or mutual support. When revolutionaries in one country were being crushed, their counterparts in neighboring nations were often powerless, and sometimes simply disinclined to offer assistance. Even more ironically, in certain instances, revolutionary movements of different nationalities clashed directly with one another, creating fissures that the Ancien regime was able to exploit to its own advantage. The fourth reason was the systematic intervention of external conservative powers. Russians are Nicholas I, viewing himself as the last bastion of Europe's conservative order, intervened in Hungary with an army of 150,000 men, thereby bringing the revolutionary movement there to a definitive end. Meanwhile, in France, Louis Napoleon dispatched troops to suppress the Roman Republic under the pretext of protecting Catholicism and French interests. This action vividly revealed the political complexities of that era. The very products of revolutions sometimes became the instruments used to suppress it. 7. What did a failed revolution leave behind? The revolutions of 1848 failed. This is an almost indisputable conclusion when viewed through the lens of short-term history. However, if we extend our gaze to the decades that followed, we discover that this failed revolution actually left behind an incredibly rich historical legacy. On an institutional level, many of the political demands articulated in 1848 were gradually realized over the ensuing decades, albeit often in ways the revolutionaries themselves had never anticipated. The reforms abolishing serfdom within the Austrian Empire were preserved, triggering a profound transformation of rural society across Central Europe. Although Prussia rolled back many of its reforms during the 1850s, the seeds of a constitutional framework and a parliamentary system had already been sown. proving impossible to completely eradicate. France, for its part, ultimately established a stable Third Republic in 1875. Regarding national unification, the movements of 1848 demonstrated in the most direct manner possible that nationalism was a political force that could no longer be ignored. The unification of Germany and Italy were achieved in 1871 and 1861, respectively. Their paths differed starkly. Bismarck relied on blood and iron rather than parliamentary debate, while Cavour utilized diplomatic alliances and military conflict rather than idealistic manifestos. Yet, the national consciousness mobilized in 1848 undoubtedly provided the deep political soil in which both unification movements took root. On an intellectual level, 1848 greatly accelerated the differentiation and maturation of political ideologies across Europe. The revolutionary experience compelled liberals to recognize the limitations of purely constitutional reform, while forcing nationalists to confront the complex reality of conflicting national aspirations. Furthermore, the failure of the revolutions sparked profound reflections on revolutionary strategy. Indeed, the analyses of French politics written in the aftermath of 1848 remain classic texts in the field of historical sociology to this day. This year profoundly shaped the fundamental trajectory of European political thought for the century that followed. In the realm of international relations, the revolutions of 1848 permanently shook the conservative international solidarity upon which the concert of Europe, the Vienna system, relied for its survival. Austria's dependence on Russian aid during the crisis sowed the seeds of future discord between the two nations. Meanwhile, French intervention in Italian affairs reignited France's strategic ambitions in both the Mediterranean and on the European continent. During the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, the system of alliances among Europe's major powers underwent a fundamental realignment, a restructuring whose historical roots can be traced, in part, back to the fissures created in 1848. 8. The legacy of spring. Let us return to the historical tableau with which we began, the spring of 1848, and the flames that simultaneously erupted across the European continent. The flames eventually died down. The Ancien regime regained its footing, the barricades were cleared, and the prisons were filled with revolutionaries. On the surface, it appeared to be an utter failure. Yet, historical judgment is rarely a simple matter of either-or. The British historian A.J.P. Taylor famously remarked that 1848 was the moment when history reached a turning point and failed to turn. This description is at once insightful and somewhat overly pessimistic. History did not, in fact, come to a halt. It merely chose a more circuitous path along which to continue its forward march. The political ideals that met with defeat in 1848, constitutional rule of law, national self-determination, the abolition of feudal privileges, the expansion of political participation, and the safeguarding of fundamental civil rights, did not perish with the failure of the revolutions. Instead, they went underground, gradually permeating the institutional fabric of European society in myriad ways over the ensuing decades. Ultimately, at different times and in different guises, they evolved into the fundamental building blocks of modern European political civilization. In this sense, the springtime of peoples may never have truly ended. It merely buried its seeds deep within the soil, waiting through the long cycle of seasons to re-emerge in a more resilient form. Today, when we speak of constitutional democracy, national self-determination, and the protection of human rights, we stand upon the very foundations laid by those. The land was plowed by the revolutionaries of 1848 with their passion and blood. Dear viewers, that concludes this episode. In our next installment, we will focus on the restructuring of the European political landscape following the revolutions of 1848, specifically, the complete historical process by which Bismarck achieved German unification through his blood and iron policy, and how Cavour advanced the unification of Italy through a combination of diplomacy and warfare. Thank you for watching. We look forward to seeing you next time.